Manhattan, September 2019. In a law office overlooking Central Park where glass windows reflected the emerald canopy of autumn trees but offered no warmth, Paulina Porizkova sat at a polished mahogany table staring at a document that read like a script she had never been invited to audition for. The will lay before her like evidence in a crime scene, each page a testimony to methodical erasure. Her name, once blazoned across Sports Illustrated covers, once worth millions in Estée Lauder contracts, once whispered in love songs, had been systematically deleted as if 28 years of marriage had been nothing more than a draft that needed editing. The woman who had once commanded the world's attention with a single glance now sat in a sterile conference room, invisible to the very document that should have acknowledged her existence. The transformation was complete and devastating. From the face that launched 1,000 campaigns to a ghost haunting her own life story, the legal language fell like cold steel. I make no provision for my wife, Paulina. The words didn't just disinherit her, they erased her as methodically as deleting files from a computer, as if she had been nothing more than temporary data that could be removed without consequence. The woman who had once graced the cover of Sports Illustrated, who had commanded million-dollar contracts with Estée Lauder, who had been the face that launched 1,000 campaigns, now sat in a sterile conference room learning that she was financially destitute. Beauty is a ticket to ride, not a destination, she had once said. But she was discovering that sometimes the ride ends with being thrown from the train while it's still moving at full speed. The irony was devastating. Here was a woman who had built her career on being seen, who had mastered the art of making millions of people look at her now discovering she had been invisible in the most important relationship of her life. The whole world had watched Paulina. But the one person who needed to see her, who had promised to love and protect her, had spent years planning her disappearance. Beauty is a ticket to ride, not a destination, she had once said. But she was learning that sometimes the conductor throws you from the train while it's still moving at full speed, leaving you stranded with nothing but the memory of motion and the echo of wheels on tracks that will never carry you again. I lost my husband, my money, and my sense of safety all at once, she would later write. But even those words couldn't capture the full scope of the psychological devastation. Here was a woman who had built her career on being seen, who had mastered the art of projecting confidence and sensuality for cameras, now forced to confront the reality that she had been invisible in the most important relationship of her life. The supermodel who had made a fortune from her ability to make people look at her had been ignored by the person who was supposed to love her most. The news of Ric's betrayal sent ripples through the fashion industry and beyond as people struggled to understand how someone as successful and seemingly sophisticated as Paulina could have been left so vulnerable. But her story was not just about one marriage gone wrong. It was about the systematic ways that women, regardless of their professional success or public recognition, could be rendered powerless by legal and financial systems designed to protect everyone except the people who most needed protection. As details of the will emerged, one question haunted every conversation. Was this the final cruelty of a marriage that had been dying slowly for years? Or had Paulina been living a lie so complete that even she had been fooled by her own performance as the happy wife of a rock star? But to understand how it all ended in that Manhattan law office, we must first journey back to Communist Czechoslovakia, where a young girl named Paulina Porizkova learned that survival often meant becoming someone else entirely, and that beauty could be both salvation and trap for those brave enough to bet everything on the power of their own image. In the industrial city of Prostayov in 1965, where gray buildings stretched toward gray skies and political oppression made personal expression dangerous, Paulina Porizkova was born into a world that would teach her early lessons about the fragility of safety and the necessity of adaptation. Her father, Jiří, was an intellectual whose political views made him a target of government surveillance, while her mother, Anna, was a woman caught between love for her husband and terror for her family's survival in a system that punished independent thought. The political upheaval that swept through Czechoslovakia during Paulina's childhood was both historical tragedy and personal prophecy. The first time someone would remove her from documents where she belonged. When her parents made the desperate decision to flee to Sweden, they were forced to leave their 3-year-old daughter behind, unable to take her without risking the success of their own escape. The separation was supposed to be temporary, but temporary stretched into years that felt like lifetimes for a child who couldn't understand why her parents had disappeared, why her name had been erased from their daily lives as completely as if she had never existed. This was the template that would echo through her entire life, first abandoned by parents who chose survival over presence, later erased by a husband who chose control over love. The child who was left behind in Communist Czechoslovakia was rehearsing for the woman who would be left behind in a Manhattan will. Both times discovering that love was not enough to guarantee visibility, that need was not enough to guarantee inclusion, that even blood and marriage could not protect against systematic erasure. The foster care that followed was both protection and abandonment, as Paulina learned to navigate a world where the adults who were supposed to care for her were strangers who had their own problems and limitations. Each new home was both opportunity and reminder that she was displaced, unwanted, a burden that other people had agreed to carry but had never chosen to love. The childhood that should have provided security and unconditional love instead became a masterclass in emotional survival, teaching her to charm strangers, to make herself useful, to become whatever version of herself would make other people comfortable enough to let her stay. The reunion with her parents when she was finally able to join them in Sweden was both salvation and stranger danger, as she discovered that the people she had idealized during years of separation were themselves struggling with trauma, displacement, and the challenge of rebuilding lives that had been shattered by political forces beyond their control. Each conversation was both reconnection and revelation that family love could not automatically heal wounds that had been created by years of separation and uncertainty. Could these early childhood experiences have laid the foundation for later triumphs and tragedies? The evidence was written in every relationship she would later enter, which combined desperate need for security with sophisticated skills for reading other people's emotions and adapting her own personality to meet their needs. The girl who had learned to survive by being useful, charming, and beautiful was developing the abilities that would later make her valuable to photographers and devastating vulnerable to men who understood how to exploit her need for approval and financial security. School in Sweden provided both opportunity and cultural challenge, as Paulina struggled to master a new language while also navigating the social dynamics of adolescence in a culture that was completely different from anything she had previously experienced. Each day required choosing between maintaining connection to her Czech heritage and embracing Swedish customs that might make integration easier, but also meant abandoning parts of her identity that felt essential to her sense of self. The modeling career that began almost by accident when she was discovered at age 15 was both escape from ordinary limitations and introduction to a new form of performance that would define the rest of her life. The photographers who saw potential in her angular features and striking bone structure were offering something that school and family had never provided. The possibility that her difference could be an asset rather than a liability, that the qualities that made her feel like an outsider could become the foundation for financial independence and international recognition. But the same beauty that opened doors to modeling success also made her vulnerable to a different kind of exploitation, as she discovered that being photographed required not just physical attractiveness but psychological availability, the willingness to become whatever fantasy the camera required while maintaining enough authentic presence to make those fantasies seem real rather than artificial. The transformation from Paulina Porizkova to Paulina Porizkova was both practical necessity and symbolic rebirth, as the teenage girl who had been displaced by political forces reinvented herself as someone who could transcend national boundaries and cultural limitations through the universal language of beauty and desire. The new name was both opportunity and erasure, freeing her from the limitations of her refugee status while also separating her from the cultural roots that had shaped her understanding of herself and the world. The early modeling jobs that brought her to international attention were both artistic breakthroughs and business transactions, as Paulina learned to navigate an industry that celebrated her uniqueness while also demanding that she conform to standards of beauty and behavior that had nothing to do with her authentic personality or desires. Each successful photograph was both validation of her commercial value and reminder that her worth was entirely dependent on her ability to embody other people's fantasies about feminine perfection. Was the success they achieved truly worth all the pain they endured? The evidence was accumulating in Paulina's increasing awareness that her professional identity was consuming her personal development, that the skills that made her valuable to photographers were making it difficult to form authentic relationships with people who were interested in her actual thoughts and feelings rather than her capacity to project idealized versions of femininity and sexuality. The move to New York in the early 1980s represented both career breakthrough and cultural shock, as Paulina discovered that American modeling was more competitive, more commercial, and more demanding than anything she had experienced in Europe. The industry that embraced her as an exotic newcomer also established expectations about her availability, her willingness to travel constantly, and her capacity to maintain the kind of physical perfection that could withstand the scrutiny of high-definition cameras and magazine close-ups. Behind all that apparent glamour and success, was there already a young woman struggling to distinguish between the confidence she projected professionally and her actual feelings about herself and her prospects for genuine happiness? The teenager who had learned to survive by adapting to other people's needs was discovering that modeling required an even more sophisticated form of self-erasure, as she had to become a blank canvas upon which other people could project their commercial and artistic visions. The Sports Illustrated swimsuit issue cover in 1984 that made Paulina an international sensation was both career pinnacle and first golden shackle, as she discovered that fame could provide financial security while chaining her to an image that would become both armor and prison. The photograph of her in a white bikini on a pristine beach became iconic, not just because of her beauty but because of the way she seemed to embody both innocence and sophistication, accessibility and mystery, qualities that made her appealing to the broadest possible audience while also making her a prisoner of perfection. Each magazine cover was like a brick laid on the golden road to glory, the same road that would become the walls of a prison built from eternal youth that time always betrays. The modeling contracts that followed were both financial breakthrough and sophisticated trap, as Paulina discovered that success in the beauty industry meant making a devil's bargain with age itself. Every year would bring her closer to obsolescence. Every wrinkle would be evidence of her failure to maintain the only quality for which the world valued her. The photograph that made her famous was both artistic achievement and commercial product, but it was also a trap that would define her public identity for decades. Each subsequent job would be measured against that moment of perfect capture. Each relationship would be influenced by men who were attracted to the fantasy, rather than interested in the reality. Each business decision would be complicated by the assumption that her value was primarily visual rather than intellectual or emotional. The modeling contracts that followed her Sports Illustrated success were both financial breakthrough and artistic limitation, as Paulina discovered that being successful in one kind of photography did not automatically translate into other forms of creative expression. The Estée Lauder contract that made her one of the highest-paid models in the world was also a form of golden handcuffs, requiring her to maintain not just her appearance but her public persona in ways that had little connection to her private interests or aspirations. Each successful campaign was both achievement and reminder that her career was built on qualities beyond her control. Genetics, aging, market preferences that could disappear without warning and leave her with no obvious path to continued relevance or income. The woman who was being celebrated for her beauty was also learning to fear the passage of time in ways that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with the economic realities of a career built on physical appearance. The relationship with Ric Ocasek that began in the mid-1880s represented both romantic salvation and sophisticated entrapment, as Paulina found herself drawn to a man who was 21 years older. Old enough to be the father she had lost to political chaos, experienced enough to seem like protection against an industry that had taught her to fear her own aging. Ric was both sanctuary from the fashion world's cruel mathematics and another form of performance requirement, as she had to learn to be not just a wife, but the wife of a rock star whose fame operated by different rules than her own. The age difference that initially seemed romantic gradually revealed itself as power imbalance, creating dynamics where Ric's experience could be weaponized against her youth, where his established career could be used to minimize her professional achievements, where his financial sophistication could be deployed to make her dependent rather than equal. Each decision about her career became a negotiation with someone who had decades of practice manipulating women who were young enough to confuse control with care, protection with imprisonment. The marriage that had begun as mutual attraction and artistic collaboration slowly transformed into another modeling job, requiring Paulina to project domestic happiness while managing a household where her husband's needs, schedule, and artistic temperament took precedence over her own career development, emotional needs, or long-term financial security. She was performing the role of devoted wife for an audience of one who held all the economic power and most of the legal protections, someone who could rewrite her story without her consent and call it love. Did this tragic event mark their downfall, or was it simply the tipping point of deeper problems? The marriage that had begun as mutual attraction and shared artistic interests gradually revealed itself as another form of performance, as Paulina learned to be the supportive wife, the understanding partner, the woman who could absorb whatever emotional or financial chaos her husband created while maintaining the public image that both their careers required. The children who followed provided both purpose and additional complexity, as Paulina struggled to balance motherhood with professional obligations while also managing a household where her husband's needs and schedule took precedence over her own career development or personal growth. Jonathan and Oliver became both her greatest joy and unwitting witnesses to the systematic dismantling of their mother's independence, watching as the woman who had once commanded magazine covers gradually transformed into someone whose primary identity was defined by her service to their father's artistic temperament and domestic requirements. Each family photograph was both celebration of domestic happiness and documentation of erasure, as Paulina learned to smile for cameras that captured her in the role of supportive wife and devoted mother, while concealing the growing awareness that she was disappearing into those roles as completely as if she had never possessed any other identity. The same skills that had made her valuable as a model, her ability to project whatever emotion the situation required, her capacity to make other people comfortable with their own desires and fantasies, were now being deployed in service of family harmony that required her own authentic needs to remain invisible. The financial arrangements that Ric gradually assumed control over were presented as protective gestures rather than strategic maneuvers. Each decision about investments, expenses, and legal documents framed as evidence of his love and concern rather than systematic preparation for her eventual abandonment. The woman who had once negotiated million-dollar contracts was slowly excluded from conversations about money, told that such discussions were too complicated or stressful for her to manage, that her role was to focus on family and beauty while he handled the practical aspects of their shared life. The modeling assignments that continued throughout her marriage were increasingly filtered through Ric's opinions about what was appropriate for his wife, creating a situation where her professional choices were subject to approval from someone whose own career had never been constrained by anyone else's domestic expectations. Each job became a negotiation not just with agents and photographers, but with a spouse who had strong feelings about how his wife should be photographed, what kinds of products she should endorse, and how much travel her work should require. But perhaps most insidious was the gradual erosion of her professional relationships, as Ric's need for her constant availability made it difficult for her to maintain the kinds of industry connections that might have provided alternative sources of income and creative fulfillment. The same protectiveness that initially seemed romantic revealed itself as isolation, as Paulina discovered that her husband's love required her to prioritize his needs over the professional relationships that had once provided her with independence and artistic satisfaction. The writing career that she developed during the later years of her marriage was both creative outlet and unconscious preparation for survival, though she wouldn't understand its true importance until after Ric's death left her financially devastated. The articles and blog posts she wrote about beauty, aging, and women's experiences were initially dismissed by her husband as hobbies, pleasant diversions that didn't interfere with her primary responsibilities as wife and mother. But the skills she developed as a writer, the ability to articulate complex emotions, to connect personal experience to broader social patterns, to build an audience interested in her thoughts rather than just her appearance, would later become the foundation for her reconstruction of both identity and income. The early writing assignments for magazines and websites provided modest income but enormous psychological value, as Paulina rediscovered the pleasure of being valued for her intelligence and insight, rather than just her willingness to embody other people's fantasies. Each published piece was both professional achievement and act of rebellion, evidence that she possessed abilities that extended far beyond the modeling career that was increasingly constrained by age discrimination and her husband's expectations about appropriate work for someone in her position. The online presence that she gradually developed through social media platforms was both authentic self-expression and strategic career move, as she learned to use technologies that hadn't existed during her modeling heyday to build audiences interested in her actual personality and experiences. Each post was both personal revelation and professional opportunity, demonstrating that her value extended beyond physical beauty to include humor, wisdom, and insights about topics that resonated with women facing similar challenges in their own marriages and careers. But the same authenticity that made her writing compelling also created tension in her marriage, as Ric became increasingly uncomfortable with his wife's public discussions of topics that he felt should remain private. Each article about the challenges of aging in an image-conscious industry, each social media post about the realities of long-term marriage, each public acknowledgement that her life was more complicated than it appeared in magazine spreads was met with criticism from someone who preferred his wife to maintain the mysterious perfection that had initially attracted him to her. Behind all that apparent domestic bliss, was there an unbearable loneliness that nobody saw? The evidence was mounting in Paulina's growing awareness that her marriage had become another form of modeling job, requiring her to project contentment and stability while dealing with private struggles that she was not allowed to acknowledge publicly, without risking damage to both their reputations and their income. The aging process that should have been a natural transition became a professional crisis and personal battleground. As Paulina confronted not just the fashion industry's systematic discrimination against women over 40, but also her husband's changing attitudes toward a wife whose commercial value was declining. The decision to age naturally without plastic surgery was both personal choice and political statement. A refusal to conform to industry expectations about how women should respond to the physical changes that time brings to everyone. But the same authenticity that made her a role model for other women also made her less marketable to clients who preferred the artificial perfection that surgical intervention could provide. Each wrinkle became both badge of honor and career obstacle, evidence of integrity that came with measurable professional costs. The modeling assignments that had once been plentiful became increasingly rare, replaced by campaigns that specifically sought mature models as tokens of diversity rather than genuine appreciation for the beauty and wisdom that age could bring. The industry that had celebrated her youth was not interested in her maturity, regardless of how gracefully she approached the inevitable changes that no amount of money or fame could prevent. But the reduction in modeling work also created psychological space for other aspects of her identity to develop. As Paulina began to explore interests and abilities that had been subordinated to the demands of maintaining her appearance and availability for whatever the fashion industry might require. The writing that had begun as a sideline gradually became a passion as she discovered the satisfaction of articulating thoughts and experiences that resonated with other women facing similar challenges in their own lives and careers. The blog posts and articles that she wrote during this period revealed someone who was thinking deeply about topics that extended far beyond fashion and beauty. Someone whose experiences with marriage, motherhood, aging, and professional reinvention provided insights that couldn't be gained through any amount of formal education or theoretical study. Each piece she published was both personal exploration and social commentary, demonstrating that her value as a public figure could extend beyond her physical appearance to include intellectual contributions that might outlast any photograph. The legal battles that followed Ric's death were both practical necessity and crash course in how thoroughly women could be disadvantaged by systems designed to protect family assets while leaving spouses vulnerable to abandonment. The lawyers who represented her interests had to confront not just the specific provisions of Ric's will, but the broader legal framework that allowed husbands to make unilateral decisions about marital property without their wives' knowledge or consent. Each court filing was both step toward justice and education in how marriage law actually functioned versus how most people assumed it was supposed to protect both partners equally. The discovery process that followed revealed the extent to which Ric had systematically hidden assets, made financial decisions without consultation, and structured their shared life in ways that maximized his control while minimizing her legal protections. The woman who had trusted her husband to act in their mutual interest discovered that trust itself had been weaponized against her financial security. The media attention that accompanied her legal struggles was both burden and opportunity, as Paulina found herself thrust into a public conversation about women's financial vulnerability in marriage that she had never intended to join but was uniquely qualified to inform. Each interview was both personal revelation and political education, as she learned to articulate experiences that many women shared, but few had the platform or courage to discuss publicly. The support that came from unexpected quarters, other women who had experienced similar betrayals, legal professionals who recognized the systematic nature of her situation, feminist organizations that understood the broader implications of her case, provided both practical assistance and emotional validation, that her experience was not unique but representative of problems that extended far beyond her individual circumstances. The book that emerged from this period was both memoir and manifesto, detailing not just her personal journey from supermodel to abandoned wife to activist advocate, but also the broader social and legal structures that made her experience possible and predictable. Each chapter was both personal story and case study, demonstrating how someone with her advantages, fame, education, professional success, could still be rendered powerless by systems designed to prioritize male control over female independence. The speaking engagements and media appearances that followed the book's publication were both income opportunities and forms of therapy, as Paulina discovered the healing power of transforming private pain into public education. Each conversation with audiences who had read her story was both validation of her experiences and evidence that survival was possible even after betrayals that seemed designed to destroy the possibility of recovery. Can anyone ever truly escape from the shadow of their darkest moments? The later years of her marriage were marked by increasing financial control as Ric systematically took over management of their household expenses, investments, and business decisions. What had initially seemed like protective care gradually revealed itself as methodical isolation, as Paulina discovered that she had no access to bank accounts, no knowledge of their actual financial situation, and no legal protections that would allow her to challenge decisions made in her name but without her input. The writing career that she developed during this period was both creative outlet and unconscious preparation for financial independence. As Paulina began to establish an identity that was separate from both modeling and marriage, the articles and books she wrote about women, aging, and authenticity were both personal exploration and professional insurance, creating income streams that were not dependent on her appearance or her relationship to her husband. But the same writing that provided intellectual satisfaction also revealed the gap between the confident public persona she had developed and the private uncertainty she felt about her marriage, her financial security, and her prospects for authentic happiness in a relationship that seemed to require constant performance of contentment she did not actually feel. The final years before Ric's death were marked by increasing tension as Paulina began to assert more independence while also recognizing that her husband's health was declining, and their relationship was becoming more caregiver-patient than equal partnership. Each conversation about their future required balancing her desire for autonomy with her genuine love for someone who was becoming increasingly dependent on her care, while also becoming more controlling about aspects of their life together that affected her long-term security. Were these final decisions acts of surrender or courageous acts of self-preservation? The separation that preceded Ric's death was both acknowledgement of marital failure and attempt to salvage whatever authentic relationship might still be possible between two people who had grown apart while also remaining financially and emotionally entangled in ways that made complete independence difficult to achieve. The last conversations between them were both attempts at reconciliation and negotiations about practical arrangements that would allow them to remain connected as co-parents and former partners, while also creating space for individual growth that their marriage had not been able to accommodate. Each discussion was both expression of ongoing care and recognition that their relationship had become toxic in ways that neither of them seemed capable of repairing. The morning of September 15, 2019, when Paulina found Ric dead in his townhouse, marked both end of their relationship and beginning of her discovery of how thoroughly she had been deceived about the basic facts of their financial situation. The grief that should have been purely emotional became complicated by practical crises that revealed the extent to which her trust had been systematically betrayed by the person who was supposed to protect her interests. The will reading that followed Ric's death was both legal proceeding and psychological execution, unfolding like a scene from a noir film where the victim finally understands how thoroughly they have been betrayed. The lawyer cleared his throat, legal language falling like surgical incisions, each word precise and devastating. Paulina read and reread the sentences, waiting for a typo, A clerical error, some mistake that would explain why her name appeared nowhere in the document that should have acknowledged 28 years of shared life. But there was no mistake, only methodical erasure, as if their marriage had been nothing more than an advertising campaign that could be deleted when the contract expired. "I make no provision for my wife, Paulina," was not just a legal clause, but a philosophical statement. After nearly 3 decades of marriage, 2 children, and countless sacrifices of her career for his comfort, she had been reduced to nothing more than an unwanted expense to be eliminated from the budget of his legacy. The discovery was both end and beginning, the final betrayal of someone who had been preparing her abandonment for years while requiring her to perform gratitude for protection that had always been conditional on her continued usefulness to his vision of domestic arrangement. Each legal sentence was evidence that she had been living in a marriage that existed primarily in her imagination, while her husband had been planning a future that didn't include her survival. When news of her disinheritance became public, the responses revealed both the support she had earned through years of authentic self-expression and the cruelty that successful women could face when they acknowledged vulnerability. The same people who had celebrated her beauty and professional success were divided between those who saw her situation as evidence of systemic discrimination against women, and those who blamed her for not protecting herself better against predictable male exploitation. Was their death as straightforward as reported, or were powerful hidden forces involved? The answer was written in every contract she had never been allowed to read, every financial decision made without her knowledge, every legal arrangement that had prioritized his control over her security. The forces that had destroyed her financial stability were not hidden. They were celebrated as marriage, traditional gender roles, and the assumption that beautiful women should be grateful for whatever protection men were willing to provide. The aftermath of Ric's death forced Paulina to confront not just grief and financial crisis, but the recognition that she had spent 28 years in a relationship that had systematically prepared for her abandonment while requiring her to perform gratitude and contentment. The woman who had been famous for her beauty was learning that attractiveness provided no protection against the cruelest forms of intimate betrayal. But Paulina's response to devastation was not retreat, but revolution, as she began to use her platform and her writing skills to expose the legal and cultural systems that made her situation possible. Each blog post, each interview, each public discussion of her experience was both personal therapy and political activism, transforming private pain into social commentary that helped other women understand and prepare for similar betrayals. The book she wrote about her experience was both memoir and warning, detailing not just the emotional costs of discovering that her marriage had been built on deception, but the practical challenges of rebuilding financial security after decades of professional absence from industries that had moved beyond her previous areas of expertise. Each chapter was both personal revelation and educational resource, showing readers how someone with her advantages could still be vulnerable to systematic exploitation. The speaking engagements and media appearances that followed were both income opportunities and forms of activism, as Paulina used her fame to draw attention to legal reforms that would better protect spouses from financial abuse and abandonment. Each conversation was both discussion of her specific situation and broader analysis of how successful women could be rendered powerless by systems designed to prioritize male control over female independence. The social media presence that she developed during this period was both authentic self-expression and strategic career move, as she learned to use platforms that had not existed during her modeling heyday to build audiences interested in her thoughts and experiences rather than just her appearance. Each post was both personal revelation and professional opportunity, demonstrating that her value extended far beyond her physical beauty to include intelligence, humor, and wisdom earned through experiences that could benefit other women facing similar challenges. Today, Paulina Porizkova represents something unprecedented in the fashion world. A former supermodel who has successfully transformed personal trauma into social advocacy, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary act is refusing to disappear quietly when powerful people have decided your visibility is inconvenient. The woman who once said, "Beauty is a ticket to ride, not a destination," has discovered that the most important journeys begin after the ride has ended, when you must walk forward on your own power rather than depending on transportation provided by others who may have destinations in mind that don't include your survival. The face that once sold millions of dollars worth of products has become the voice of women who refuse to accept that their value should be determined by others' desires rather than their own achievements. But the transformation has come at a cost measured in years of performing happiness she didn't feel, marriages that were really extended modeling jobs, and the discovery that even the most successful women can be rendered invisible by systems designed to protect everyone except the people who most need protection. People once bought cosmetics because of her face. Now women seek out her voice to learn how to survive. Beauty has an expiration date, but truth does not. The supermodel who was famous for being pretty has become a woman respected for being strong, proving that sometimes destruction is just another word for renovation, and that the end of one story can become the foundation for something more important than anything that came before. In choosing to speak rather than suffer silently, to fight rather than fade gracefully, Paulina has transformed personal betrayal into collective resistance. The ticket to ride may have expired, but the destination she reached by walking was always more valuable than any place she could have been taken by someone else. The mirror that once reflected perfect beauty now shows lines earned through surviving experiences that no amount of cosmetics can conceal. And she has learned that some forms of beauty can only be achieved by refusing to be erased, even when the people who claim to love you have spent years practicing the art of your disappearance.